I'd like to introduce you to my favourite kind of marker, and I'm always surprised that people don't use this form of marking their knitting more often. I'm going to work now to the beginning of my round. I prefer 4 needles in my work and a 5th one to knit with when I'm working in the round on double points, but when you're filming the 4th needle gets in the way, so I've economised down to 3 needles. Now I know my beginning of the round point is in between these 2 knits, and that's also indicated by that tail there. And in real life I would quite often use my tail as my marker yarn, but it's much clearer if you use a bright contrasting colour. So I could just take this tail up and pop it between the needles like so, or as we're going to do this properly, I'm going to take a nice contrasting yarn that's not too thick, because we don't want to create a space between the stitches, and lay it in between the needles at the point that we wish to mark. So in this case it's a beginning and end point. And when I knit over the top of it, it becomes sandwiched in the work. And I was also careful to make sure that I had the yarn sort of about equal on both sides of the fabric. If you have it right at the end of the piece of yarn, chances are you'll sit on the end and it will pull out. And nothing further happens to that piece of yarn until we get back to that beginning of round position. There's one further thing that I should mention. If you happen to be a left-hand yarn operator, i.e. throw the yarn with your left hand, if you use this kind of marker, you're going to have to make sure that the marker yarn goes beneath the working yarn. So when I work my next stitch, that yarn will become trapped in that position. And that's really the only difference for left-hand yarn operators. So you have to make sure that you don't put the yarn over the top, like so, because it will never get trapped. You tuck the yarn underneath the working yarn, and the same marker will work for you. When you get back to the start of round point again, you'll see it indicated by the marker yarn. And one more stitch and I'm back at the start of the round. There's the tip of the piece of yarn. We can take either end at this point because it's only threaded through the work once, but take whichever end is the upper end and flip it in the opposite direction. I flip it every round initially. First I flip it, then I flop it. And I like to circulate my stitches when I'm working on double points so that I don't get any problems with corners, and I'll carry on onto this needle. And for this reason it's really useful to have marker yarns, because they're not always going to be at the beginning of a needle. They're not always going to be in a certain position. And so if you've got a marker yarn in there, you're free to move your stitches around any way you like. One of the great attributes of this kind of marker, not only are they free and they don't get in the way and they don't tangle up your yarn, but it doesn't matter if they happen to be at the junction between 2 needles. It's not going to fall off the needles and fall on the floor. So I'm just going to flip the upper end through again. And after this round I'm not going to bother using this marker yarn for a couple of rounds, and then I'll just keep on moving it backwards and forwards. So we'll take another look when the knitting has gone further along. As you can see, it's been a while since I flipped my marker, and that can be intentional or accidental, it doesn't matter which. And it's not too late for me now just to take the upper end of the marker yarn and flip it back to the other side of the work. You'll find the marker yarn shows up even more clearly on the purl side. I can flip my marker and carry on my way. But I can also use this marker as a counting mechanism. And so if I tuck my knitting needle in to the same spot where the marker went through and just open it up like so, I can see that I've done 4 rounds since I last flipped the marker. And so if I were doing increases on every 4th round, and I've last flipped it on an increase round, so that would be increase and then 1, 2, 3, and so that would tell me it's time for another increase on this round. So I could flip my marker yarn and know that this was an increase round. And when I'm done, I can count the number of increments of this marker yarn, almost like an abacus. And you can use it just for counting. It doesn't have to count increases. If you wait until there's been 10 rounds since you last flipped the marker yarn, you can then just count the number of ins and outs of your marker yarn up your work. That's very useful for sort of fluffy fabrics that are hard to count. And if you keep your marker yarns in the work, you can compare the front and the back pieces later. If you don't want to keep the marker yarn, you can just keep pulling it up the work with you. But if you do want to keep the marker yarn, just tie on another piece of yarn when you get to the end of the current piece that you're working with. Running yarn markers have a lot of possibilities for recording your knitting as you go. Another advantage of this kind of marker is the fact you can move it around the circle. These are the air-conditioned gloves from my book, A Little Book of Big Holes for Hand Knitters. And at the edge of the cuff, the beginning of round travels straight up. But once you get into the pattern section, the beginning of round migrates by 4 stitches at the end of each stripe. So we're just coming to the end of this garter stitch stripe. And I've got 2 more stitches to purl. And that's my end of round point. I can flip my marker, and now I'm going to pick up my green working yarn, which is hiding at the back of the work, and continue at the start of the next round. But I also know that I want to move my red yarn along. So I'm going to knit my first green stitch, weave in my red yarn so that it will be in the right place when I next want to stripe. And I'll weave it up one more time, and I'm going to leave that yarn there. But I also know that this is now my new start of round position, so I'm going to move my marker yarn back again. So it's marked and followed the migration of the beginning of the round point. And now I can continue in my green working yarn for a full round, set up my next set of patterns, and when I know when I get back to this marker just here that I'm back at the beginning of round point and that I've moved my beginning of round by 4 stitches.